Ask any expecting mother today what she's most afraid of, and childbirth pain is almost always near the top of the list. Now imagine going through that same process 20,000 years ago. No epidurals, no hospitals, no painkillers of any kind. Just a woman, her body, and whatever the people around her happened to know. And yet the species survived. Billions of births happened before modern medicine ever existed. So the question isn't whether ancient humans endured childbirth pain. They obviously did. The real question is what they actually did about it, because the answer reveals something far more sophisticated than most people assume. And it starts with understanding why the pain exists in the first place. Human childbirth is uniquely painful compared to almost every other mammal on Earth, and the reason traces back to the same evolutionary conflict that shaped human birth in general: the obstetrical dilemma. A pelvis narrowed for efficient bipedal walking, forced to deliver a skull carrying the largest brain relative to body size of any primate. That tight fit doesn't just make birth difficult, it makes it mechanically painful in a way that's almost unique to our species. Most mammals give birth in minutes. Human labor can last 12 hours, 18 hours, sometimes more, with the infant's skull bones only partially fused, deliberately compressible, squeezing through a passage that was never quite wide enough to make the process easy. Evolution didn't eliminate this pain. It couldn't. The anatomical trade-off was locked in hundreds of thousands of years before anyone thought to ask whether it hurt. But here's what's genuinely surprising. Once you start looking at the archaeological and anthropological record, ancient humans weren't passively suffering through this. They were actively problem-solving, generation after generation, using every tool available to them. And the first tool, long before any medicine, was other people. Childbirth among nearly every documented hunter-gatherer society was never a solitary event. Anthropological studies of groups like the Hadza of Tanzania and the Juhwansi of the Kalahari consistently show birth attended by experienced women, usually mothers, aunts, or older women who had already given birth multiple times themselves. This wasn't just emotional comfort. These attendants provided physical support during contractions, helped position the mother's body to ease the mechanics of delivery, and in many documented cultures, used specific techniques like counterpressure on the lower back to reduce the sensation of pain during peak contractions. The presence of experienced women wasn't tradition for tradition's sake. It was accumulated knowledge, refined and passed down because it measurably improved outcomes. And it is very likely one of the oldest forms of specialized medical knowledge our species ever developed. Then there's movement. Modern hospital birth, until relatively recently, often meant lying flat on your back, which is, from a purely mechanical standpoint, one of the worst possible positions for labor. It works against gravity and narrows the pelvic outlet. Ancient and indigenous birthing practices almost universally did the opposite. Squatting, kneeling, hanging from ropes or tree branches, being supported upright by attendants. Cross-cultural anthropological surveys have found that upright birthing positions were the overwhelming norm across nearly all traditional societies studied, precisely because they use gravity to assist the descent of the infant and widen the pelvic outlet by several critical millimeters. Millimeters that make a measurable difference when the fit is already this tight. This wasn't guesswork, it was body mechanics, discovered through trial and generational repetition, long before anyone understood pelvic anatomy in clinical terms. Pain relief itself has a much older history than most people realize. Archaeobotanical evidence, pollen and plant residue found at sites associated with human settlement, shows that specific plants with known analgesic and antispasmodic properties were deliberately gathered and used. Willow bark, which contains a natural precursor to aspirin, was used across multiple ancient cultures for pain relief broadly, and ethnobotanical records from indigenous societies across the Americas, Africa, and Asia document specific herbal preparations used specifically during labor to reduce pain and encourage more effective contractions. Raspberry leaf, still used today in some prenatal preparations, appears repeatedly in traditional birth practices across unrelated cultures on different continents, a pattern that suggests independent discovery of a genuinely functional remedy, not coincidence. Ancient humans were running informal clinical trials across tens of thousands of births, and the knowledge that worked got remembered. Heat was another tool almost universally documented. Warm water, heated stones wrapped in hide, warmed cloths pressed against the lower abdomen and back. The physiological effect of heat on muscle tension during labor is well understood today. It relaxes the surrounding musculature and can meaningfully reduce the perception of pain. And the fact that heat application during labor appears independently across nearly every studied traditional culture, from Arctic populations to equatorial rainforest societies, suggests it wasn't cultural coincidence. It was something that worked, discovered independently, over and over by different populations facing the exact same biological problem. Sound and rhythm played a role too, one that's easy to underestimate from a modern clinical perspective. Rhythmic vocalization, chanting, and controlled breathing patterns appear in ethnographic accounts of birth practices across dozens of unrelated cultures. Modern research into pain perception has shown that rhythmic breathing and vocalization can activate the body's own natural pain-gating mechanisms, essentially using controlled sound and breath to partially override pain signals traveling to the brain. Ancient birth attendants almost certainly didn't understand the neuroscience, but they understood the result. Women who vocalized rhythmically, who breathed in controlled patterns guided by attendants, seemed to manage contractions more effectively than those who didn't. That observation, repeated across generations, hardened into ritual, into song, into practice, passed from mother to daughter. And then there's a detail almost nobody expects. Some archaeological and ethnographic evidence points to early forms of what we'd now call psychological pain management. Distraction, reassurance, verbal encouragement timed specifically to contractions. Anthropological accounts describe experienced attendants talking a laboring woman through each wave of pain, narrating progress, offering specific verbal cues timed to the rhythm of contractions. This is strikingly similar to techniques used in modern doula-assisted births, and modern clinical studies have shown that continuous supportive presence during labor measurably reduces both perceived pain and complication rates. Ancient humans arrived at this same conclusion tens of thousands of years before anyone published a study confirming it. None of this eliminated childbirth pain. Nothing available to ancient humans could have. The obstetrical dilemma is a hard anatomical constraint, and no amount of herbal knowledge or positioning technique changes the fundamental geometry of a human pelvis and a human skull. Maternal mortality during childbirth was, for the vast majority of human history, catastrophically high compared to modern rates, and pain was simply a reality that had to be endured, managed, and survived rather than solved outright. But what the archaeological and anthropological record makes clear is that ancient humans were never simply gritting their teeth and hoping. They were accumulating, testing, and refining an entire body of practical knowledge, medical care in every meaningful sense of the term, built entirely without writing, without formal science, without a single microscope, refined purely through observation and repetition across hundreds of generations of women, helping other women survive the single most dangerous moment in the human reproductive cycle. The epidural in a modern delivery room and the willow bark tea brewed by a Paleolithic birth attendant are separated by tens of thousands of years and radically different technology, but they come from exactly the same impulse. A species that refused to simply accept pain as unchangeable and instead spent its entire existence looking for ways to make survival just a little more bearable. One birth, one generation, one discovery at a time.